selling possessions in order to pay off these types of things. Local, small picture scenario. There was a church in Texas, in the San Antonio area, that 4 years ago it was discovered that there was a teenage boy who was 16 years old, who for the past 2 years had been volunteering in the nursery with 3- and 4-year-old kids. And part of his job as a nursery worker was to take the boys to the bathroom when they needed to go. And while in the bathroom, he was doing things he shouldn't have been doing. Okay? Well, when this came to light, it was discovered that there were probably, as far as they could tell, about 15 different kids that had had this done to them at some point. And the church thought the most immediate and pressing need was to try and pay off the families so it didn't become a national media story. There was no concern whatsoever for the 15 kids who had been accused. It was just, let's deal with this, let's move on. We don't want this to, affect our church. Well, it's already affected the church. Okay? They just didn't understand how deeply it affected the church. The church ultimately ended up not only splintering multiple times, but the church is no longer even in existence. Because it was more important that they deal with the issue than to deal with the victims that are there. So what I want us to do is to talk for just a little bit here about some areas of importance, areas of concern, if you will, regarding legal and safety issues. The first of these is clergy malpractice. And this is defined by law as failure to exercise reasonable degree of skill in the performance of professional duties, such that injury results to another. The first case of this was Nally versus Grace Church of the Valley in 1988. Does anybody know who was the pastor of Grace Church of the Valley in 1988? John MacArthur. Okay. The Nally family sued the church after their son committed suicide. Their son had been in some depression for several years, and he went to a pastor on staff for counseling. And the pastor had been doing counseling with him for several years. Well, the family sued the church, claiming that they were responsible for their son's suicide. The court studied the system, or studied the issue, and agreed with them. And the church had to pay out $2.7 million because of the issue. Why? Because the pastor who was doing the counseling was not a trained clinical counselor, but was operating in that stead. I think part of the issue is that the courts to date have not and do not seem inclined to acknowledge the existence of what's called a tort of clergy malpractice. In other words, exempting clergy members from being sued for malpractice. Instead, they've said, you're taking on the responsibility for someone else. And as such, you have to be held responsible if it does not go well. So some things that can help us in terms of preventive measures or tips that I want to suggest in terms of the issue of clergy malpractice is one is you need to do an annual insurance review with your local church. Does your church cover if you're engaged in something for which you're going to be sued? If you're acting in good faith and the church gets sued anyways, is your insurance company going to cover that? And one of the things that's being encouraged these days is your church has an umbrella policy generally that covers most things, but there probably should be separate riders that cover each of the staff members individually in case there's a lawsuit brought against them for something. Two, I want to suggest that you may want to attend one of the various clergy malpractice workshops that occur. There are more and more groups that are offering legal advice to clergy, simply to help them know what they can and can't do in that process. There's a wonderful little newsletter called the Pastor, Church, and Law newsletter. And it really is just chock full of those latest kind of cases and why these cases went to court, why the church lost, what could have helped in that process, what are the types of procedures and policies you need to have in place as a part of that. I think churches, as a general rule, also need to have church discipline that is stated rather than just acknowledged. It needs to be written out and be enacted as policy. Do you have arbitration or reconciliation agreements that are in place in terms of how they handle disagreements? What happens if a pastor on staff, if an opening occurs in another area, and he or she thinks that they're the best fit for that, but the senior pastor hires someone else? They could claim this issue of sexism. They could claim this an issue of ageism. I mean, they could claim lots of things as why they were bypassed for that quote-unquote promotion to that area. So do you know how to handle that? And does your staff sign out these agreements that this is how things will be handled if a lawsuit or something is brought? Okay. And I think one of the most important things in terms of dealing with issues of clergy malpractice is don't ever underestimate what could happen. You know, I think a lot of times we just simply take for granted that people are going to act in good faith. And unfortunately, they don't always. You know, we live in an incredibly litigious society these days, and we've got to understand what that looks like. So there's the issue of clergy malpractice. A second area that we've got to be considerate of in terms of understanding the risks that are out there is the issue of counseling. Is anybody in here in the MAPC or MAC program, Master of Arts in Counseling or Pastoral Counseling? One of the things that we're finding is that the counseling field is really cracking down in terms of regulations of who they certify as counselors. There's a organization that, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but the acronym is KCREP, that is now like the global body for overseeing counseling and setting the standards that counselors have to meet in terms of education. Our entire seminary counseling programs have had to undergo significant revision in the last 2 years to meet these standards so that our graduates can now graduate and be able to move on in their thing. But they're really becoming particular about who can and who cannot counsel. Now, the reality is that we have pastors who do counseling all the time. They've had 1 or 2 pastoral counseling classes as part of their BA or their MDiv. And they think that they know what they're doing in the process of this. And I think we have to make a really clear distinction between pastoral counseling and counseling. Those are 2 markedly different types of things. Ministers who are employed full-time, okay, that's a key word there, full-time, in pastoral ministry by a local church, are free to counsel with church members in the course of their employment, primarily in the area of spiritual formation and in everyday life issues. But that pastoral counselor has to understand what are the limitations legally and ethically for them in terms of the types of things that they should be dealing with. Okay. And some of that comes from state to state. The different states have different, places where that benchmark is put. But you need to know what your local state has to say about those issues. If you don't, you could be setting yourself up for a big time, shove back if you're engaging in things that your state has said that these are the province only professional counselors in those areas.
What are some definitions of day-to-day?
Trying to help someone think through financial issues. Someone's experiencing marital discord and trying to help them, reconcile with their spouse. something that's not a day-to-day issue, someone comes to you suffering from depression. Okay? You don't have the clinical expertise, to help make that next step. Someone comes to you and confesses that they've had thoughts of killing themselves. You don't have the clinical expertise to help them take that next step forward. In your counseling, pastoral counseling that is, a minister cannot use the term psychology or any derivative thereof unless they are a licensed certified psychologist. Okay. One of the things that has become, unfortunately, more and more of a problem within the church itself is counselors, pastoral counselors, and church members who end up becoming involved in compromising situations, sexual relationships. The vast majority of the time, it's sexual relations between male clergy and female counselees. But the other has occurred. And it often happens for one simple reason, that the pastor, the male, and the female meet together without anyone else. We know in counseling, professional counseling, that when a counselor and a counselee come together in these sessions, that it's really easy for what's called transference to occur. You understand what transference is? It's basically when the counselor looks at the counselor as their savior, as the person who has the answers, and they want to be like them, they want to get to know them better, and they suddenly start having close feelings of intimacy toward them because they're helping them with issues that they're struggling with. And it's really easy for those close feelings of intimacy to carry over into a romantic feeling. Okay? Similarly, it's very easy for those on the counseling side to get so intertwined in someone else's life and to feel that they're the one really making the difference here. It's because of my expertise, because of my skill that I bring to the table. And then they realize that they have incredible power over this person's life and can get them to do things that the person might not do otherwise. Chris?
Could you talk about this and the boundary that between this and a counselor or a pastor as a counselor meeting with someone of the same gender but different sexual orientation?
Okay. So if a male counselor is meeting with another male who may have homosexual tendencies.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to suggest that the same rules apply that we're going to talk about for females and males meeting together. Part of that, one of the things that should never happen is the two should never be in a room by themselves with the door closed. Okay? I don't care who it is, it just shouldn't happen. Even if the person you're meeting with is a male with a male and you're both heterosexual. There's just too many possible things that could go wrong in that seminary. There's a reason in this seminary why every faculty office has a glass window in the door. It's to protect the school. And it's because in the 11 years that I've been here now, we've had 2 faculty members who were dismissed because of sexual harassment charges. You think of, it's not going to happen anyplace, it's not going to happen here. But in 11 years, we've had 2. And I think part of the problem has become that it's so easy to become secretive in terms of how one operates. So as a general rule, if you're ministering in your local church and doing counseling, doing pastoral counseling that is, A, there should always be someone else nearby. B, if your door doesn't have a big window in it that others can look in at any given point and see what's going on, the door needs to be open. C, try to meet in public spots if possible. Your office is not a public spot. In fact, for the vast majority of you who will go into pastoral ministry, you won't even be at a church that's large enough to have a full-time secretary outside your office all the time. So often if someone comes to see you, you're the only one there. And then if even if nothing happens, the possibility of he said, she said, is very real. All it takes is one disgruntled church member to levy charges that are completely false. But the moment they levy those charges, your reputation is tarnished. Even if you're proven that you were vindicated, your reputation is tarnished. And it will take you years to overcome. Because all people will remember is the charge. It's always fascinating. Someone, Mike Mail, who's a sociologist at Pepperdine University, did a study of this issue of clergy who were accused of sexual misconduct and who were later exonerated. And what he found was this, that in about 80% of the cases, when it happened, when the accusation was made, it was the lead story on the television news, or it made the front page of the local paper, and would be there for several days or weeks, as the story was unfolding. And then there would come a point where the pastor was exonerated, and it either received no attention, or it was on the back page, just a small little blurb. So that's all people remember, was that the charges were leveled. And they don't know that it was reconciled. They don't know that you were proven not guilty. But all they know is that, oh yeah, that's the pastor who did that. And that's what the community remembers. And often, unfortunately, what ends up happening is the pastor ends up having to leave. Go to someplace new where they can start afresh in that process. I want to also suggest that as part of this process, whether it's with males or females, that you have to understand your own limitations. What can you genuinely offer help with? And then have a ready list, resource list, that you can look at to refer for other issues. Do you know the Christian counselors in your town? I mean, the trained, licensed, certified folk. And do you know what their specialty areas are? Can you refer as needed? The student that Andrew's been talking about, who's kind of dealing with this sexual orientation issue. Not every Christian counselor is equipped to deal with that. Some, though, that's kind of a specialty area for them. So do you know the differences? Do you know what they can really handle and what they can't? One of the things I'll suggest for you is that you, especially those of you working with teenagers, but I think this is true in other areas as well, is that you want to find someone who works in systems theory counseling as a general rule. You know what systems theory counseling is? It understands that if you're coming in to see me about an issue, that it's not just what you're experiencing, but there are people around you that contribute to this issue. And so if we're going to deal with you, we're going to deal with the family as well. So mom and dad and siblings are coming in as well. And we're going to meet with each person individually, and then we're going to meet with you all collectively. Because no person is acted upon or acts upon by themselves. They're always impacted upon by others, and others impact them. Okay? And I want to suggest that some other things that you can do in this area of kind of the counseling. As I said, know your state's laws. What exactly do they require? What are the prohibitions that ministers can and can't do? We talked about insurance coverage earlier. One of the things that you need to start doing if you're going to counsel, whether it's with students or adults, is you need to have them sign release forms. That when they come in, that's just a simple form that basically says, here are the things that I'm qualified to talk about, and I'm asking for you to register that you understand that as we go through. And if it goes beyond those boundaries, then we're going to look at referring you. I don't want to hurt, I don't want to exasperate the situation any worse than it already is by trying to do something I'm not qualified to do. I am the first to recognize that all the things I just talked about and then ministry just don't seem to go together well. Because part of ministry is being engaged in people's lives. And it's forming that type of intimate community that's important as far as the Christian faith community goes. But we live in a world that if we don't take the time to protect ourselves, we don't take time to establish proper boundaries, we're ultimately going to get burned in that process. You know, I mentioned that you don't counsel someone, you know, by yourself with no one else present. I think that also holds true, and this is a big issue in youth ministry, that you're the last person in church waiting for a person of the opposite gender to be picked up by their parents. Again, nothing may happen, but you know, there is a thing where, especially females to males, female students to male students, is that they tend to, or female students to male youth pastors, they tend to look at the youth pastor as more than a father figure, but almost a romantic interest, a person that they would like to be able to date. And it doesn't happen with every girl, but there's a significant number of them that it does.